The Battle of Midway was a naval battle in the Pacific Ocean between the United States of America and Imperial Japan, lasting 4 days. It started on June 4th of 1942 and ended on June 7th. The initial attack was planned by the Japanese, specifically Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto was heavily invested in destroying the U.S. aircraft carriers, which he deemed to be the most important asset to the Americans. The hope was to bring in such a large-scale invasion on Midway that the U.S. would be forced to bring in these carriers. Once they did this, the Japanese could finally attack the carriers, which had caused many problems for the Japanese, including the bombings of Tokyo 2 months prior. U.S. crypto analysts had broken Japanese code earlier in 1942 and were able to figure out not only would the Japanese attack Midway, but also that the attack would take place on June 4th. The decoding also allowed the U.S. to find out that the Japanese planned on weakening the U.S. battleships with aircraft and having their battleships finish off the job. This information was huge for the U.S. and Admiral Chester Nimitz, who could now plan to counter the Japanese on their plan. On the morning of June 4th, the Japanese launched their first aerial attack on Midway. The planes were headed back to their carriers when they heard news of the American Navy in the area. The U.S. then would attack and destroy 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers. Despite successful attacks from the Japanese aircrafts, the final carrier would be sunk later in the afternoon. On June 5th, Yamamoto would bring multiple cruisers and battleships to bombard Midway, but Admiral Raymond Spruance would bring his own fleet to meet them. Over the next 3 days, they would continue the fight until the Japanese were forced to retreat on June 8th. The Japanese would lose roughly 3,000 men, 4 aircraft carriers, 2 destroyers, 2 cruisers, and hundreds of planes. The U.S. suffered 300 casualties, 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and 150 planes lost, making the U.S. decisive winners of Midway. The U.S. victory at Midway was crucial for many more reasons than defending Midway itself. With such substantial losses to the Japanese Navy, Japan would never be able to launch a large-scale invasion against the U.S. for the rest of the war. It also prevented Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Finally, it was a much-needed victory for the U.S. after a series of losses in the Pacific to swing the momentum of the war back to their side. They would use this momentum to push the Japanese back further at other decisive battles like Guadalcanal. If the U.S. would have been defeated at Midway, the Japanese would have likely continued their island-hopping campaign in the Pacific. Thanks to everyone from the crypto analysts who broke the Japanese code, to the admirals who planned the operation, to the gunmen who fiercely stayed their ground, the U.S. was able to turn the tide of the war on the Pacific front.